I cashed out $60 million today, but instead of popping champagne, my lawyer slid a cheap plastic burner phone across his mahogany desk and told me to call my parents and lie. He told me to say I lost everything, that my company was sued, and I was completely bankrupt. If I told them about the money he warned, I might not survive the weekend. What I discovered the very next day proved he was understating the danger. My name is Zendaya Carter, and I am 32 years old. I spent the last 5 years building a health technology application from the ground up. Today was supposed to be the best day of my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to love you. The ink was barely dry on the acquisition contract. $60 million. I stared at the 9-figure number on the final page, feeling a heavy weight lift off my chest. I smiled and reached for the bottle of sparkling cider sitting on the silver tray in the center of the room. But Marcus, my lead attorney and oldest friend, placed his hand over mine, stopping me. His face was dead serious. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a sharp, calculating intensity. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a cheap, prepaid cell phone. He pushed it across the smooth wood until it rested right on top of my signed contract. "Call your mother," he said. His voice was low and firm. "Tell her the deal fell through. Tell her your primary investors pulled out, the app crashed, and you are facing a massive lawsuit. Tell her you are completely bankrupt and you do not have a single dollar to your name." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a strange joke. "Marcus, we just closed the biggest deal of my life. I am going to buy a house. I am going to pay off their church mortgage. Why on earth would I tell them I am broke?" Marcus leaned forward and folded his hands. "Zendaya, listen to me very carefully. During the final financial background checks for this merger, my team had to audit your personal accounts. Because your mother Eleanor is still listed as a secondary contact on your oldest checking account, we flagged some unusual activity. We dug deeper into your family finances. Specifically, we looked into your sister Sasha and her husband Trent." My stomach tightened at the mention of my white brother-in-law. Trent was a loud, arrogant finance broker who never missed an opportunity to belittle my business. He constantly made subtle racist remarks about how Black women were too emotional to handle real venture capital. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on because he supposedly managed a highly successful investment fund. "What about Trent?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "Trent is not a successful broker. He is drowning in debt. And your parents are fully aware of it. If they find out you have $60 million liquid, they will not just ask for a loan. They will drain you dry, and they will use every psychological trick in the book to do it. You need to call your mother right now and tell her you are ruined. You need to hear her reaction." I stared at the black plastic phone. My hands were shaking. Despite all the favoritism my parents showed Sasha, I still believed they loved me. I still believed my mother would offer a shoulder to cry on if my world fell apart. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number. I put it on speaker and set it on the desk. The line rang 3 times before she answered. "Hello, Zendaya," she said. Her tone was already impatient. "Make it quick. I am organizing the church anniversary gala, and Trent is treating us to a tasting menu in an hour." I squeezed my eyes shut and forced my voice to crack. I let out a loud sob. "Mom, it is gone. Everything is gone." The line went completely quiet. "Mom," I said, letting real tears of anxiety slip down my face. "The investors pulled out. There was a massive lawsuit regarding the data privacy of the app. I lost the company. I have zero money left. I am in debt, Mom. I am completely bankrupt. I do not know what to do. I need help." I waited for her to tell me to come home. Instead, there was silence. It stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was like solid ice. "I thought you were smarter than this, Zendaya," my mother said. "You always had to do things your own way, did you not? Your father and I told you that little health application was a complete waste of time. You should have let Trent manage your portfolio. He actually knows how to handle money, Mom. I am bankrupt, I repeated, my voice shaking for real. Now I am going to lose my apartment. I have nothing left. I need you. Do not raise your voice at me, she snapped. This is exactly why you always fail. You are far too emotional. Listen to me very carefully. Zendaya. Sunday is the 50th anniversary of our church. The mayor is going to be there. Trent is making a huge announcement about his new investment fund. Do not come to Sunday dinner, and absolutely do not show your broke face at the gala. I will not have you embarrassing this family with your massive failures. Call the bank and figure it out yourself, and cancel that supplemental credit card you let your sister use. She cannot be burdened with your financial mess right now. She hung up the phone. Just like that. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet office. I lowered the cheap plastic phone slowly, placing it back on the mahogany desk. My chest felt incredibly tight. I had spent my entire life trying to earn her approval. I got the straight A's in school. I built a company from scratch. I never asked them for a single dime. And the one time I asked for help, the one time I pretended to be completely broken, she stepped on my neck. Marcus did not say I told you so. He just sat there quietly watching the realization wash over my face. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider and pushed one toward me. I am so sorry, Z, he said quietly. Sometimes blood is just blood. It does not make them family. I stared at the glass, feeling entirely numb. A foolish part of me still wanted to make excuses for her. Maybe she was just stressed about the church event. Maybe she would call back in an hour after she calmed down and offer me a place to stay. I reached into my purse to grab my actual cell phone, hoping to see a text message from her saying she was sorry for snapping at me. Instead, the screen lit up with an automated alert from my primary bank. It was an account I had opened back when I was a freshman in college. My mother was listed as a joint account holder so she could send me money for textbooks. I had long since moved my real wealth into private corporate accounts, but I still kept a small emergency fund of $5,000 in that old checking account. It was the only bank account my parents actually knew about. The notification on my screen read, "Transfer completed. Available balance $0." My breath hitched in my throat. I quickly opened the banking application and stared blindly at the transaction history. Less than 10 minutes after I called my mother, crying about being absolutely bankrupt, she had logged into my account. She saw the $5,000 and she transferred every single penny to her own checking account. She did not leave me a dollar for food. She did not leave me a dollar for gas. She believed I was facing absolute financial ruin, and her first instinct was to strip the meat off my bones before the creditors could get to it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The heavy sadness completely evaporated. In its place, a dark, freezing anger began to spread through my veins. They were not just unsupportive parents. They were predators. They were vultures circling my life, waiting for me to drop so they could feast on whatever was left. I looked up at Marcus. My hands were no longer shaking. My tears were completely dry. "What else do you know?" I asked, my voice steady and cold. "You said Trent was drowning in debt. Exactly how much money are we talking about here?" Marcus picked up a thick manila folder from his desk. $5 million, he said. He got involved with some very dangerous people playing crypto markets. Your parents know everything. In fact, they are actively trying to help him cover it up. I stood up, taking a deep breath, walking toward the office door. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. I typed a short text to Marcus. "I am going to Sunday dinner." He looked at his phone, reading it, and nodded slowly. "Get the paperwork ready," I said. "We are going to war." I left Marcus and ordered a standard Uber instead of calling a private car. If my family wanted a broken woman, I would give them the performance of a lifetime. The ride to my parents' suburban home took 45 minutes. Their massive brick colonial sat on 2 acres of perfectly manicured lawns. It was a monument to my father's success as a megachurch pastor and my mother's status as church first lady. I thanked the driver and stepped onto the pristine driveway. I wore an old sweater and faded jeans, looking like someone who had not slept in days. I walked up the stone pathway and pushed the heavy front door open. The familiar smell of Sunday dinner hit me immediately. Roast turkey and candied yams filled the air, but the warmth of the food contrasted with the freezing atmosphere of the house. I walked into the formal dining room. The mahogany table was set with my mother's best china and crystal glasses. Sitting at the head of the table sipping bourbon was my white brother-in-law Trent. Next to him in a designer silk blouse was my younger sister Sasha. She was the golden child, simply because she married a financial advisor instead of pursuing a career. Trent looked up from his glowing phone and smirked maliciously when he saw me standing there. He leaned back in his tall leather chair and arrogantly crossed his legs, looking me up and down with obvious and unfiltered disgust. "Look who finally decided to show up," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "We were just talking about you, Z. Your mother called us earlier and said your little emotional health app finally went under." I stood firmly in this doorway, keeping my face perfectly blank and my posture entirely defeated. "It was not an emotional app, Trent," I said quietly, keeping my voice low. "It was a highly specialized medical technology platform specifically designed for Black women." Trent chuckled coldly and shook his head, taking another long sip of his strong bourbon. "Call it whatever you want," he said dismissively, waving his free hand in the air. "The open market does not care about your personal feelings or your little community social justice projects. Real venture capital requires a cold and highly calculating mind to survive. Women, especially minority women, always make the critical mistake of leading with their fragile hearts instead of looking at the hard financial numbers. I told you 5 years ago that you should have let me manage your initial seed money." Sasha reached over gracefully and patted Trent's hand, gazing at him with absolute and unwavering adoration. "You really should have listened to him, Zendaya," she said, her voice sickly sweet and entirely fake. "Trent just closed another massive corporate portfolio deal this past week. He is an absolute genius with the stock markets. He could have easily saved your little failing company from total bankruptcy." I dug my fingernails deep into my palms to violently stop myself from laughing right in her face. I knew the actual truth. I knew Trent was $5 million in debt to very dangerous underground criminals. I knew his massive portfolio deal was a complete fabrication engineered solely to cover his massive cryptocurrency losses. But I just stood there silently playing the pathetic part of the deeply humiliated older sister. I looked down at the expensive Persian rug, pretending to be completely devastated by their incredibly harsh words. Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany table, and pointed his empty crystal glass directly at me. "This is how the real corporate world works, Z," he said, flashing a blindingly white and entirely fake smile. "You foolishly tried to play in the big leagues, and you rightfully got crushed. Next time, leave the serious business to the men who actually know how to generate real wealth." Before I could even respond, heavy commanding footsteps echoed loudly in the marble hallway. My father, Pastor Thomas Carter, walked into the formal dining room wearing his custom-tailored Sunday suit. He completely ignored me, holding my gaze for only a fraction of a second before turning his attention directly to Trent. My father placed a heavy, comforting hand on Trent's shoulder and smiled warmly at him. He then turned his head slightly to look at me with profound and heavy disappointment. "Your sister and your mother told me the extremely unfortunate news, Zendaya," he said, his voice booming, with the exact same theatrical authority he used at the church pulpit. "It is an absolute shame that you squandered such an incredible opportunity. You really should have listened to Trent. He is the real businessman of this family, and you could learn a lot from his financial discipline." My father took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for the rest of us to sit down. My mother, Eleanor, walked in carrying a heavy porcelain bowl of mashed potatoes. She wore her Sunday best, a tailored white suit that perfectly matched her pristine image. She ignored me completely, setting the bowl down next to the roasted turkey. We bowed our heads for a very brief prayer. My father thanked God for the continued success of the church, and specifically for Trent and his brilliant financial mind. He completely left me out of the prayer. I kept my eyes wide open, staring at the polished wood of the table. As the serving spoons passed around, the brutal verbal assault began. My mother turned her cold gaze toward me. "I suppose you thought going to California for college made you better than us?" she said, her tone biting. "You got that fancy degree and thought you could conquer the medical technology world. You forgot exactly where you came from, Zendaya. You thought you were too good for your roots, and now look at you. You are crawling back here with nothing to show for your endless arrogance." Sasha giggled softly across the table, taking a delicate sip of white wine. "It is just embarrassing, Z," she chimed in. "You spent all those years working late nights, missing family vacations, always talking about empowering the community. And for what? A bankrupt company and a completely ruined reputation. You should have just married a good man and settled down like Mom always told you to do." Trent loudly scraped his silver fork against his plate, drawing the attention of the room. "Well, it is a tough lesson, but a necessary one," he said, chewing a piece of steak he had specially ordered for himself. "The tech sector is ruthless. It is definitely not a place for emotional charity work. Next time, maybe try opening a local bakery or a small daycare. Something a bit more your speed, Zed." I did not react. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against their relentless and coordinated attacks. I simply picked up my fork and knife and methodically began cutting a small piece of roasted turkey. I placed the food in my mouth and chewed slowly, savoring the rich flavor of the gravy. The dead silence from my end of the table seemed to echo loudly in the large, formal dining room. I could feel their hostile eyes burning into me heavily. They desperately wanted a reaction. They wanted me to break down crying, begging for their financial help, or screaming in frustration so they could quickly label me as the angry and hysterical older sister. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I took a slow sip of my iced water, my face completely blank. This deliberate stoicism only seemed to frustrate them even more. My father cleared his throat loudly, leaning forward in his tall leather chair. "Are you even listening to your mother, Zendaya?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly in genuine anger. "You sit there eating my food under my roof without a single word of apology for the immense shame you have brought upon this respectable family. You are a complete and utter disappointment." I swallowed my food and carefully wiped my mouth with the crisp linen napkin. I looked directly into my father's eyes, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I hear every single word you are all saying," I replied quietly. My voice was completely steady, without even a hint of the manufactured trembling I had used on the phone earlier today. My mother slammed her silver fork down onto the heavy mahogany table. Her carefully crafted church lady facade was beginning to crack, revealing the raw, unfiltered greed underneath. "Well, since you clearly have no intelligent plan to fix your own massive failures, we have decided to step in and fix them for you," she declared, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Your grandmother left you 30% of her estate when she passed away. It was a foolish decision on her part, but now it is the only thing of value you have left to your name." Sasha smiled brightly, wrapping her arm around Trent's broad shoulder. "Since Trent is expanding his firm, he needs a bit more collateral for his next major corporate acquisition," my sister explained smoothly. My mother nodded firmly, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Since you are completely bankrupt and clearly incapable of managing assets, you must sign your 30% inheritance over to Sasha," she demanded casually. "Trent will use it as collateral, and in return, we will graciously allow you to live in the damp basement." I looked at my mother, then at Sasha, and finally at Trent. The sheer audacity of their demand hung heavily in the dining room air. I placed my linen napkin neatly beside my plate. "No," I said simply. My voice was quiet, but completely firm. "I am not signing over my 30% of the estate to anyone." The dining room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the expensive Persian rug. Trent's smug smile instantly vanished. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the crystal glasses shake. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his face flushing a deep angry red. "I said no, Trent," I replied calmly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "That property is the only asset I have left. I am not giving it to you to use as collateral for your business." Trent stood up from his tall leather chair, towering over the table. "You are in no position to make demands. You stubborn, ungrateful burden," he shouted, pointing his finger directly at my face. "We are offering you a roof over your head. We are offering to save you from living on the streets, and this is how you repay us." Sasha immediately started crying, fake tears dabbing her eyes with her napkin. "How can you be so incredibly selfish?" "Zendaya," she whined loudly, "Trent is trying to expand his firm to secure our family's future. You lost everything because of your own stupid mistakes, and now you want to drag us down with you. Why do you always have to ruin everything?" My father stood up next, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Do not speak to your sister and brother-in-law that way." "Zendaya," he boomed, using his most intimidating pastoral voice. "This family has a legacy to uphold. Trent is working tirelessly to elevate our status, and you are clinging to a piece of property you cannot even afford to maintain. You are acting entirely out of spite." My mother crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "Your grandmother would be deeply ashamed of you right now," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with venom. "She gave you that share assuming you would be responsible. Now you are bankrupt. You are a financial liability. If you truly cared about this family, you would sign the papers tomorrow morning and be grateful we are not throwing you out into the cold." The gaslighting was so intense it actually made my head spin. They were expertly twisting the narrative, painting themselves as the generous saviors, and me as the selfish villain, tearing the family apart. They wanted me to believe that handing over $1 million asset for free was the only way to earn their basic love and respect. 5 years ago, this exact manipulation would have worked perfectly. I would have broken down, sobbing, apologizing profusely, and signing whatever they wanted, just to make them stop looking at me with such profound disappointment. But sitting there knowing the exact truth about my bank account and Trent's massive hidden debt, I saw right through their elaborate performance. They did not care about my well-being. They were desperately trying to strip me of my last remaining safety net to save their precious white savior from total financial ruin. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs. The urge to pull out my phone and show them the $60 million bank balance was almost overwhelming. I wanted to destroy their smug faces right then and there. I wanted to watch them beg. I remembered Marcus and his warning. I needed to wait. I needed them to fully commit to their trap before I sprang mine. If I exploded now, they would just find another way to manipulate me. I needed to get away from the table before my anger made me break character entirely. I pushed my chair back, letting it scrape loudly against the floor. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward in a perfect display of submissive defeat. "I am feeling overwhelmed right now," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound weak. "I need to go to the restroom. Please excuse me for a moment." I turned away from the table before any of them could hurl another vicious insult at me. I walked out of the formal dining room, leaving my untouched food behind. The heavy silence of the long marble hallway was a massive relief after the screaming and the gaslighting. I walked slowly toward the guest bathroom at the end of the hall, but as I passed the heavy oak door of my father's private study, I suddenly stopped. Frantic whispering echoed from inside the room. The voices inside were hushed, but the sheer panic was unmistakable. I stepped closer to the heavy oak door, tilting my head to listen. It was Trent and Sasha. They slipped away while my parents were lecturing me. I held my breath, straining to catch their words. What if she does not sign it? Trent hissed, his voice cracking with desperate terror. I need that property collateral by Friday, or I am dead. Do not panic now, Trent, my sister replied, her sweet voice sounding harsh. Mom and Dad have it under control. They are going to break her down. They know exactly which buttons to push to make her feel guilty enough to surrender. Give it a few days and she will be begging to sign that paper. You do not get it, Trent interrupted, his pacing echoing heavily on the hardwood floor. The crypto market tanked overnight. I am $5 million in the hole, Sasha. I borrowed it from people who do not use collections. Agencies. They use baseball bats and car bombs. If the bank does not approve the loan using her estate to cover my losses, I am going to prison. You need to calm down, Sasha snapped harshly. Mom already drained her emergency fund so she cannot afford legal counsel. Dad is contacting a lawyer friend from the church tomorrow to draft a power of attorney, just in case she stays stubborn. If she refuses to sign the property over willingly, they will claim she has gone crazy from her bankruptcy and take legal control of her assets. They are not going to let you go to prison, Trent. You are the star of the family. I stood completely frozen in the quiet hallway, feeling all the warm blood drain entirely from my shocked face. Hearing Marcus explain the massive financial debt in his pristine downtown office was one thing, but hearing my own sister actively plot my absolute destruction was entirely different. My parents knew Trent was a complete fraud. They knew he had gambled away millions of dollars on illegal cryptocurrency markets, and they were actively conspiring to steal my only remaining asset to save him. They were planning to declare me legally insane just to steal my inheritance and protect a criminal. My stomach violently churned with a deep and profound physical disgust. They had spent my entire life making me feel like an outsider, but this was a new level of pure evil. They were willing to destroy my future just to maintain their perfect country club image with their white son-in-law. I closed my eyes and took a very slow, shallow breath, trying to quiet my racing heart. I needed to grab my purse and leave this toxic house before I did something reckless like reveal that I had $60 million sitting safely in my bank account. I slowly took a step backward toward the main hallway, but in my extreme shock, I was not paying attention to where I placed my foot. My heel came down heavily on a loose wooden floorboard. A sharp creak echoed through the quiet corridor, sounding like a gunshot. The frantic whispering inside the study instantly stopped. The silence that followed was thick and terrifying. I froze completely, holding my breath, hoping they would think it was just the old house settling. The heavy brass doorknob slowly began to turn. I quickly turned on my heel and tried to walk briskly toward the guest bathroom, pretending I was just passing by. The heavy oak door swung open violently, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Trent stepped out into the hallway, his face flushed red and his eyes completely wild with raw panic and aggressive rage. He immediately saw me standing there. He did not hesitate for even a single second. He lunged forward, closing the distance. Between us, in two massive strides, he grabbed my upper arm tightly, his large fingers digging painfully into my skin, and shoved me roughly backward against the patterned wallpaper. "Where do you think you are going?" he growled, his breath smelling strongly of cheap bourbon and pure fear. "How much of that did you just hear, Zendaya?" His eyes darted frantically up and down the hallway, checking to see if anyone else was around. He leaned his face too close to mine, his expression twisting into a threatening sneer. "You listen to me, you bankrupt little failure!" He spat aggressively, tightening his painful grip on my arm. "You are going to sign that property over tomorrow, or I will personally make sure your miserable life becomes an absolute living hell. You have absolutely no idea what I am truly capable of doing to you." When I am violently pushed into a desperate corner, I stared directly into his wild, panicked eyes, refusing to blink or show even a single ounce of fear. His large hand was bruising my arm, but I did not try to pull away. I stood completely still, letting him use his physical size to try and intimidate me. This was his classic move. Whenever he felt his precious white privilege slipping, he resorted to physical threats and racial microaggressions to regain control. He leaned even closer, his sour breath washing over my face. "You people always think you are so smart," he whispered maliciously, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You think getting a little degree makes you invincible, but you are nothing, Zendaya. You are just a loud, emotional black woman who flew too close to the sun and got burned. You need me. This family needs me to save them from their own financial ignorance." I let his vile words hang in the heavy hallway air. He expected me to cry or scream or lash out in anger. He wanted me to become the angry stereotype so he could easily justify treating me like trash. But I remained perfectly calm. I slowly looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then looked back up into his terrified eyes. "You do not smell like a successful venture capitalist, Trent," I said, my voice dangerously low and completely steady. "You smell like pure, unadulterated desperation." He blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard by my icy demeanor. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing him to loosen his painful grip. "A man who just closed a massive corporate portfolio does not beg a bankrupt woman for her grandmother's house," I continued, tilting my head slightly. "A truly successful man does not hide in a study whispering about loan sharks and car bombs while his wife cries. You are not a savior, Trent. You are a drowning man, desperately trying to pull my family under with you, just so you can breathe for one more day." His face went completely pale. The angry red flush vanished instantly, replaced by the sickly white hue of absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew that I knew. He knew his entire carefully constructed facade was crumbling into dust right in front of him. "Release my arm," I commanded sharply, my voice cutting through his panic like a sharp blade. He flinched, dropping his hand as if my skin suddenly burned him. He took a clumsy step backward, stumbling slightly against the heavy oak door. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut around his own neck. "You are crazy," he stammered weakly, his previous bravado completely gone. "You are completely delusional, Zendaya. Nobody in this house will ever believe a single word you say. They know you are having a mental breakdown." Without waiting for my response, he turned around and practically ran down the long marble hallway, disappearing into the formal living room. I stood alone in the quiet corridor, rubbing my bruised arm. My heart was pounding fiercely against my ribs, but my mind was incredibly clear. I did not bother going back to the dining room to make excuses. I did not want to spend another single second breathing the same toxic air as those monsters. I walked straight to the heavy front door and pulled it open, stepping out into the cool evening breeze. I walked rapidly down the long manicured driveway, not caring that I was leaving without saying goodbye. I pulled my phone from my purse and immediately dialed Marcus. He answered on the very first ring. "They know everything," I said, breathing heavily as I reached the quiet suburban street. "My parents know Trent is $5 million in debt to underground criminals. They are planning to use a fake power of attorney to declare me legally insane and steal my property." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I heard Marcus sigh deeply, his chair squeaking as he leaned back. "I told you they were dangerous, Z," he replied, his tone grave and completely professional. "But unfortunately, it is actually much worse than you think." I stopped walking, gripping the phone tightly. How could it possibly be any worse than them trying to put me in a psychiatric ward? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Marcus paused for a moment, letting the heavy reality settle. "Just go back to your apartment and lock the door," he instructed calmly. "Do not answer any calls from your parents or your sister tonight. Come to my downtown office tomorrow. I found something else in their secret files. It is worse than you think. I will show you tomorrow, Zendaya." I did not sleep at all that night. I sat on my small living room couch, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I walked into Marcus' downtown office. He was already sitting at his large desk with a fresh cup of coffee and a massive stack of financial documents spread out in front of him. He did not say good morning. He simply turned a thick file folder around so I could read the terrifying numbers for myself. "You need to see this, Zendaya," he said, pointing to a highlighted column on the first page. Trent did not just borrow $5 million from underground loan sharks. He actively used your father's church as collateral to secure the initial investments for his fake portfolio. My jaw dropped open as I stared at the highly confidential bank records. My parents did not just know about Trent's massive financial debt. They were entirely complicit in his ongoing illegal financial fraud. My father had illegally leveraged the church property, the very building where he preached every Sunday, to fund his white son-in-law's gambling addiction. And now that the money was completely gone, the angry loan sharks were coming directly for the church. "That is exactly why they need your property so desperately," Marcus explained carefully, leaning back in his leather chair. "If Trent goes down, he is taking your father and the entire church legacy down with him. They are not just trying to protect Trent, they are actively trying to save themselves from federal prison." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was almost too much to process. They were willing to sacrifice my sanity and my future just to cover up their own massive crimes. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the mahogany desk. The caller identification showed it was my mother, Eleanor. I looked at Marcus. He nodded silently, giving me the permission to answer it. I pressed the green button and put the phone on speaker, placing it between us. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice quiet and hesitant. "Good morning, my sweet, beautiful girl," my mother said. Her voice was incredibly soft and completely dripping with fake honey. It was the exact tone she used when she was talking to wealthy donors at the church. "I am so glad you answered," she continued, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Your father and I barely slept a single wink last night. We have just been praying and praying for you, Zendaya. My heart is completely broken, knowing how much pain you are in right now." I stared down at the documents proving she was actively trying to destroy my life. The sheer audacity of her fake sympathy actually made me nauseous. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered, forcing myself to sound vulnerable. "We were far too harsh on you at dinner yesterday," she said, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "We were just so shocked by the news of your bankruptcy. But you are our flesh and blood, Zendaya. We love you unconditionally. Your father and I want to help you fix this terrible mess. Cannot bear the thought of our oldest daughter losing her apartment and ending up on the streets." I looked at Marcus, who was silently shaking his head in absolute disgust. "How do you want to help me?" I asked, playing right into her manipulative hands. "We want to come over to your apartment today," she offered eagerly. "Your father called a very good lawyer friend of his from the congregation. We want to bring him over to help you sort out all of your complicated bankruptcy paperwork. We can help you protect whatever small assets you might have left before the greedy creditors take absolutely everything. It will be completely free of charge. We just want to protect you, my sweet girl." The trap was now completely laid out before me. They were coming to force me to sign the fake power of attorney. They wanted to declare me legally insane and steal my property to save their own miserable lives. I took a deep breath, looking at the verified bank statement on Marcus' desk that showed my actual $60 million balance. I knew exactly what I had to do. "That would be wonderful, Mom," I said, letting out a fake sigh of immense relief. "I am just so overwhelmed and I really need your help right now. I am at my old apartment. Please come over whenever you are ready." I hung up the phone and looked up at Marcus. He smiled coldly and started packing the files. "The trap is officially set," I said quietly. "Let them come." I left Marcus and drove to a terrible part of town. I had a college friend who managed a rundown apartment building, and I paid her cash to let me borrow a vacant unit for the afternoon. It was perfect for my performance. The wallpaper was peeling. The carpet smelled heavily of stale cigarettes, and the single window looked out over a loud, busy highway. I sat on a broken folding chair in the middle of the empty living room and waited. My tiny, hidden Bluetooth earpiece was securely tucked beneath my thick braids. At exactly 2, there was a loud, aggressive knock on the flimsy wooden door. I stood up and pulled the door open. My mother Eleanor walked in first, holding a designer silk scarf over her nose, as if the very air inside the apartment was going to poison her. My father. Pastor Thomas followed closely behind her, wearing his expensive tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the cramped, dingy hallway. Then came Sasha and Trent. Trent was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting around the small space. Finally, a greasy-looking man stepped into the room. "Oh, my poor sweet Zendaya!" My mother gasped dramatically, clutching her pearl necklace. "Look at how you are living. This breaks my heart into a million pieces. We simply cannot allow our flesh and blood to stay in a terrible place like this." Sasha crossed her arms, hugging her expensive purse tightly to her chest. "It smells like garbage in here, Z," she complained, wrinkling her nose. "You really hit absolute rock bottom, did you not?" My father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, trying to look like the benevolent patriarch. "We are here to rescue you, Zendaya," he proclaimed loudly. "This is Mr. Henderson, a very trusted legal advisor from our church congregation. He has graciously agreed to help us untangle this massive financial mess you have created for yourself." Mr. Henderson flashed a completely insincere smile, displaying heavily coffee-stained teeth. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Zendaya," he said smoothly, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. "Your parents have explained your unfortunate bankruptcy situation to me. If you do not act quickly, the federal creditors are going to seize every single asset tied to your name, including the property your grandmother left you. We need to shield that asset immediately before it is too late." Trent stepped forward, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight with intense desperation. "It is just standard legal protection, Z," he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You transfer the deed to Sasha temporarily. Once your bankruptcy clears, we can figure out the rest. But you need to sign these papers right now before the banks freeze everything you own." I kept my face perfectly frightened and submissive. I nodded slowly, reaching out with trembling hands to take the thick stack of papers. They felt heavy in my grasp. I walked over to the small kitchen counter, pretending the lighting was better over there. Under the guise of carefully reading the fine print, I pulled out my cell phone. "I do not really understand all this legal jargon," I whispered, letting my voice shake. "Let me just use my phone flashlight to read the clauses." My mother sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Just sign the bottom line, Zendaya." She snapped, her fake sympathy already wearing dangerously thin. "We do not have all day to sit in this disgusting room." I ignored her. I held my phone over the documents, quickly snapping high-resolution photos of every single page and silently sending them directly to Marcus. The camera shutter sound was turned off. I dragged my fingers slowly down the pages, pretending to read the complicated legal text, while my heart hammered fiercely against my ribs. I waited for Marcus to review the files. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Trent was impatiently tapping his expensive leather shoes against the stained linoleum floor. My father was staring at me with a heavy, expectant glare, trying to force me into submission through sheer intimidation. They all thought they had me completely trapped. Suddenly, the tiny earpiece hidden beneath my hair crackled softly. Marcus' voice came through completely cold and utterly serious. "Zendaya, do not sign a single page of those documents," he warned. "This is not a simple property transfer, and it is absolutely not a bankruptcy shield. I am looking at a full medical and financial power of attorney. It is paired with an involuntary psychiatric hold. They are not just trying to steal your property, they are actually trying to declare you completely insane and lock you inside a mental institution." The cold reality of Marcus' warning echoed loudly in my hidden earpiece. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legal text under the harsh light of my phone. The words blurred together for a second, before snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. Section 4 pertained to a comprehensive medical proxy. Section 5 outlined the strict conditions for an involuntary committal based on severe emotional distress and complete financial incompetence. My own flesh and blood did not just want to steal my grandmother's house. They wanted to erase my freedom entirely. They wanted to lock me in a clinical white room and drug me into absolute silence so they could bleed my remaining assets dry to save Trent's miserable life. I slowly lowered my phone and looked up. The four of them were watching me like starved wolves waiting for a wounded deer to finally collapse. The fake sympathy on my mother's face was already slipping rapidly, revealing the rigid impatience underneath. My father was tapping his gold watch against his wrist. "What exactly is Section 4 of this document?" I asked, my voice deliberately flat and devoid of any trembling. "Why is there a medical proxy clause in a standard bankruptcy filing, Mr. Henderson?" The greasy lawyer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his expensive Italian suit. "Well, Zendaya, given the extreme traumatic nature of your sudden financial ruin, your parents felt it was absolutely necessary to ensure your mental well-being is legally protected. It is merely a standard precaution for someone in your incredibly fragile state of mind." I turned my gaze to my mother. "A standard precaution," I repeated slowly. "Section 5 grants you and Dad the absolute authority to commit me to an involuntary psychiatric facility. You are actively trying to declare me legally insane." The loving church lady facade instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. My mother dropped her designer silk scarf and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are completely insane," she hissed, stepping toward me with her hands curled into tight fists. "You destroyed a multi-million-dollar tech company because you are an emotional wreck. You are a danger to yourself and a massive liability to this family. We are taking control of your life before you ruin us completely." Sasha scoffed loudly, tossing her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder. "Just sign the stupid papers, Z," she snapped aggressively. "You owe us this much. Trent is trying to save our family's reputation while you sit here playing the victim in a filthy rundown apartment. You always have to make everything so incredibly difficult for us." I looked at my father, expecting the pastor to at least attempt to maintain some moral high ground. Instead, he puffed out his chest and used his booming pulpit voice to intimidate me. "You will sign those documents right now, Zendaya," he commanded, his face turning a dark shade of angry red. "You have disgraced my name for the very last time. You are clearly having a severe mental breakdown, and I will not allow your hysterical behavior to drag my prestigious church through the mud. The entire congregation is already whispering about your massive failure. You are entirely unfit to manage your own life, and I am stepping in as your father to take the wheel." I stood my ground, clutching the heavy papers tightly against my chest. "You do not care about my mental health," I said, staring directly into my father's furious eyes. "You care about the $5 million Trent lost to dangerous underground crypto loan sharks. You care that you illegally leveraged the church mortgage to fund his gambling addiction. You need my grandmother's property to cover your massive financial crimes." The entire room went completely dead silent. The color drained so fast from my father's face he looked like a ghost. Sasha gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Mr. Henderson suddenly looked incredibly panicked, realizing he was standing in the middle of a massive federal fraud conspiracy, and his legal license was suddenly in extreme jeopardy. But Trent did not shrink back. Instead, the arrogant white financial advisor stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was practically towering over me. His chest was heaving, but his eyes were filled with a sick, twisted kind of triumph. He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that bounced off the peeling walls of the cheap apartment, making my skin crawl with absolute disgust. "So, you eavesdropped on us last night?" Trent sneered, pointing a sharp finger directly at my face. "You think knowing that changes absolutely anything, Zendaya? Look around you. Look at where you are standing right now. Look at the pathetic shoes on your feet. You are a completely broke, bankrupt failure living in a disgusting slum. You have $0 to your name and a documented history of being an emotional and aggressive black woman who could not handle the pressure of the tech industry." He leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour against my cheek. "Who do you honestly think the police or the judges will believe?" he whispered maliciously. Are they going to believe a hysterical, unhinged woman raving about crypto conspiracies? Or are they going to believe a highly respected megachurch pastor and a successful white financial advisor? You have absolutely no power here, Z. You are nothing. Sign the papers, or I swear to God, we will have men in white coats drag you out of here in a straitjacket before sunset. Trent stepped back, breathing heavily as his threat hung in the stale air of the apartment. My father immediately stepped into the space Trent vacated, using his massive physical presence to tower over me. He did not reprimand his son-in-law for threatening me with a psychiatric ward. Instead, he puffed out his chest and adjusted his expensive suit jacket. He looked down at me with the same righteous fury he used when condemning sinners from his wooden pulpit every Sunday. You will listen to your brother-in-law Zendaya. My father boomed, his voice shaking the thin walls. You have always been too arrogant for your own good. You strayed from the path of righteous submission, and now God has humbled you by destroying your business venture. We are your family, and I am the patriarch. It is your holy duty to submit to my absolute authority right now. He pointed a heavy finger at the stack of documents on the counter. You have brought nothing but chaos and shame into our lives. He continued, his face red with anger. Your refusal to accept our help is a clear sign of your deteriorating mental state. No sane woman would reject the protection of her father. If you force me to make that terrible phone call to the hospital, I will do it without hesitation. I will do whatever it takes to protect my church from your toxic emotional instability. You are going to sign those papers, and you are going to beg Trent for forgiveness. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of my father's words, my mother began her theatrical performance. She collapsed against the kitchen counter, burying her face in her hands and letting out an agonizing wail. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing thick tears to roll down her powdered cheeks. "Why are you testing us like this?" Eleanor cried out, her voice echoing dramatically. "Why did you give me a daughter who hates her own flesh and blood? I sacrificed my youth to raise you, Zendaya. I gave you everything you needed, and this is how you repay my love. You want to see your parents out on the streets. You want to destroy the legacy your father built from nothing." She reached out and grabbed my wrist, her manicured fingernails digging into my skin. "Do you have any idea how deeply humiliating it is for me to show my face at the church gatherings?" she sobbed, shaking my arm aggressively. "Every woman in the congregation knows you are a bankrupt failure. They look at me with such pity because my eldest daughter is an unhinged disaster. Trent is stepping up like a real man to save us from financial ruin. He is the only one trying to hold this beautiful family together. You owe him your absolute gratitude. Just sign the papers, Zendaya, so we can finally put this terrible nightmare behind us and get you the serious medical help you desperately need." I stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent kitchen light as their coordinated psychological abuse reached its absolute peak. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, making it difficult for me to breathe. I looked at my mother crying fake tears of victimhood. I looked at my father using God to justify his massive financial crimes. And I looked at Trent standing in the background with a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. The crushing reality of the situation hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. They were not bluffing about the psychiatric hospital. They were perfectly willing to lock me inside a clinical white room and let doctors drug me into absolute silence. They would gladly sacrifice my freedom and my sanity to protect a white man who secretly despised them. My chest tightened painfully, and a hot wave of pure, unadulterated heartbreak washed over me. Real tears began to well up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I was not crying because I was afraid of Trent or his pathetic threats. I was crying because the parents I had spent 32 years trying to impress were officially dead to me. The people standing in this dirty apartment were nothing but soulless monsters. I let the heavy tears spill over my eyelashes, allowing them to stream silently down my cheeks. My shoulders slumped heavily forward in a posture of complete and utter defeat. Sasha smiled brightly, seeing me finally break down. Mr. Henderson eagerly pushed the thick stack of papers closer to me, tapping his gold pen against the signature line. I let out a loud broken sob and slowly reached out my trembling hand. I grabbed the cold pen from the counter as my family leaned in, practically drooling with raw, unfiltered greed. I gripped the heavy gold pen and pressed the sharp tip firmly against the thick white paper. My hand was visibly shaking, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I quickly scribbled my name across the bottom signature line of the terrifying medical proxy and the property transfer forms. But I did not write my actual legal signature. My middle name is Marie, but I deliberately signed the documents as Zendaya Eleanor Carter, using my mother's name as a silent, mocking internal joke. Furthermore, the signature itself was completely backwards, leaning left, instead of my standard right, leaning cursive. Marcus and I had established this exact variation years ago for emergency legal situations just like this one. It was a legally void signature under state law, completely invalidating the entire stack of fraudulent documents. The second the pen lifted from the final page, Mr. Henderson practically snatched the documents right out from under my trembling hand. He quickly shoved them into his expensive leather briefcase, snapping the gold latches shut with a loud, satisfying click. Instantly, the suffocating atmosphere in the tiny kitchen completely shifted. The theatrical performance was officially over. My mother Eleanor stopped her dramatic sobbing in a fraction of a second. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a silk tissue, and calmly patted away the fake tears from her powdered cheeks. She did not even look at me anymore. Her eyes were completely cold and indifferent as she turned toward the apartment door. My father. Pastor Thomas cleared his throat loudly. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and stood up perfectly straight, completely abandoning the concerned patriarch act. "Well, that is settled then," he announced, his voice devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Zendaya. We will contact you next week to let you know what we decide to do with your living situation. Do not call us until then. We have a massive church gala to prepare for, and we cannot be distracted by your constant emotional instability." Sasha did not say a single word. She just smiled brightly, adjusting her expensive purse, and linked her arm through my father's, walking away without a backward glance. Trent lingered behind for a moment, leaning casually against the peeling wallpaper of the kitchen entrance. He looked around the dirty, empty apartment with a profound look of absolute disgust. He then looked back at me, his white savior complex shining brightly in his arrogant eyes. "You should probably wash your face." "Z," he mocked, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "You look like a complete disaster right now. Enjoy the damp basement. Maybe you can finally learn how to code a real application down there instead of begging us for handouts." He chuckled maliciously and turned around, walking out the door. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind them with a loud, solid thud. The rusty lock clicked into place, leaving me entirely alone. I stood perfectly still in the center of the quiet room. I listened closely to the sound of their heavy footsteps fading quickly down the dingy hallway stairs. As soon as there was complete silence, my slumped posture instantly vanished. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my stiff shoulders back to release the built-up tension. I reached up and wiped the lingering tears from my cheeks. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The terrified, broken victim was entirely gone. I walked over to the broken folding chair and sat down calmly, crossing my legs. My tiny hidden earpiece crackled to life. Marcus' voice came through crystal clear. He sounded incredibly energized. "They took the bait perfectly," he said. "I reviewed the high-resolution photos you sent. Your signature is completely legally void. They currently hold absolutely zero power over you or your personal assets. But I have even better news, Zendaya. I just received the final confirmation emails from the major banking institutions." "What is the status?" I asked, feeling a massive surge of pure adrenaline pumping through my veins. "It is completely done," Marcus confirmed, his voice filled with fierce triumph. "Our private holding company just officially purchased every single cent of that massive crypto debt from those dangerous underground lenders. Trent no longer owes them anything, because he now owes us everything." We also successfully bought out the entire mortgage of your father's megachurch from the regional bank. They walked out of here thinking they just stole your last remaining safety net. But they are completely wrong. You did not just protect your inheritance today. You just bought their entire lives. You legally own your family Z. They belong to you now, and they have absolutely no idea what is coming. We are going to destroy them both completely. I immediately left the dirty decoy apartment and quickly tossed the metal keys into the nearest green dumpster. I never looked back. An hour later, I was standing in the center of my brand new $4 million penthouse, overlooking the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the massive living space in warm, natural light. The floors were imported marble, and the kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design. It was a staggering contrast to the peeling wallpaper and stale air I had just endured. I had purchased this property under a blind trust weeks ago, but stepping into it now felt entirely different. It was no longer just a real estate investment. It was my fortress. Over the next 5 days, Marcus and I worked tirelessly to finalize the intricate paper trail. We spent hours in his downtown office combing through every single financial record. I read the official bank transfers confirming my private holding company now owned the entirety of Trent's massive crypto debt. We also finalized the acquisition of my father's church mortgage. The regional bank was more than happy to offload the high-risk loan for a lump sum of cash. I held the thick, crisp documents in my hands, staring at my own name printed boldly on the creditor lines. I was now the sole legal owner of my father's megachurch, and I was the primary debt holder for my arrogant white brother-in-law. The legal trap was absolutely ironclad. They had absolutely no loopholes and no escape routes. Despite the fierce adrenaline of our strategic planning, the emotional fallout hit me harder than I expected. On the fourth night, I sat completely alone on my expansive velvet sofa, staring out at the glittering city lights below. A heavy, profound grief washed over me. I was not mourning the family I had just lost. I was mourning the family I never truly had. I realized that for 32 years I had been desperately chasing a mirage. I wanted a mother who would hold me when I was terrified. I wanted a father who would protect me fiercely. I wanted a sister who would stand by my side. But those people simply did not exist. They were fictional characters I had projected onto deeply broken and selfish individuals. Sitting in my quiet, luxurious penthouse, I finally allowed myself to accept the cold, hard truth. Blood simply meant we shared genetic material. It did not automatically guarantee love or loyalty. They chose greed over my well-being. They chose to protect a criminal over their own flesh and blood. And because they made that choice, I had to harden my heart and prepare to burn the bridge completely to the ground. There would be no second chances, and absolutely no forgiveness. The evening of the 50th church anniversary gala finally arrived. The air in my penthouse was thick with quiet anticipation. I stood in front of my massive vanity mirror preparing for the final battle. I hired a professional styling team to ensure my appearance was absolutely flawless. I slipped into a custom-tailored emerald green designer gown that hugged my curves perfectly. I clasped a heavy diamond necklace around my throat. My hair was styled in an elegant, sophisticated updo. I looked nothing like the broken, bankrupt woman they had abandoned in that dirty apartment just a few days prior. I looked exactly like a woman who had $60 million sitting comfortably in her bank account. Down in the city, my family was currently reveling in their completely fabricated victory. I knew exactly what was happening at the massive church banquet hall. My father was undoubtedly shaking hands and accepting generous donations from his wealthy congregation. My mother was smiling brightly, wearing her Sunday best, and playing the perfect devoted church first lady. Sasha and Trent were sitting at the VIP table, completely convinced they had successfully stolen my grandmother's property to save themselves from absolute financial ruin. They fully believed they had won the war. They were preparing to take the stage and announce Trent's new investment fund to the entire community, using my supposed mental breakdown as their stepping stone to greater wealth. They were completely unaware that the executioner was already on her way. I grabbed my expensive designer clutch and walked toward the private elevator. The smooth metallic doors slid open silently, inviting me to begin my descent. I stepped inside, taking one final deep breath to steady my racing pulse. Marcus was waiting for me in the opulent marble lobby below, alongside a highly trained team of imposing private security guards. We marched out into the cool night air together. It was officially time to show my incredibly toxic family what real absolute power actually looked like. Inside the massive banquet hall of my father's megachurch, the atmosphere was thick with manufactured holiness and extreme financial arrogance. The room was dripping in excessive luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the hundreds of round tables draped in expensive white silk. The floral centerpieces alone must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. The entire congregation was dressed in their absolute best designer suits and extravagant evening gowns, all eager to celebrate 50 years of the Carter family religious empire. I stood quietly in the dark shadows of the grand foyer with Marcus and my security team, watching the spectacle unfold on the large closed-circuit television monitors mounted near the entrance. My mother Eleanor was seated prominently at the primary VIP table, right in the front row. She wore a sparkling silver dress that caught the light every time she moved, and she was smiling so brightly it looked physically painful. She leaned over to clinking her crystal champagne flute against Sasha's glass. Sasha looked equally triumphant, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for a fact Trent could not actually afford. They were completely soaking in the admiration of the wealthy church members, fully believing their dark financial secrets were safely buried under my forged signature. On the massive elevated stage, the live gospel choir finished their final soaring note and the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The stage lights dimmed slightly and a single bright spotlight illuminated the polished wooden pulpit. My father, Pastor Thomas, walked out slowly carrying his expensive leather-bound Bible. He raised his hands high into the air, commanding absolute silence from the massive room. The congregation quieted down immediately, hanging on to his every single word. "We are gathered here tonight not just to celebrate 50 years of our beautiful church, but to celebrate the profound blessings of generational wealth," my father boomed, his rich baritone voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "God desires for us to prosper. He desires for us to build lasting legacies that will secure our families for decades to come. But building a legacy requires immense sacrifice. It requires making incredibly difficult decisions and pruning the dead branches so the rest of the tree can truly flourish." I felt my jaw tighten. The dead branch he was referring to was obviously me. He was standing in front of his entire congregation, twisting his betrayal and greed into a wholly righteous act. He was actively using his religion to justify throwing his own daughter into a psychiatric ward. "We have faced immense financial trials this year." My father continued, lowering his voice to sound deeply vulnerable and humble. "The enemy tried to attack our family and our foundation, but God sent us a protector. He sent us a man with a brilliant mind and a steadfast spirit to guide us through the dark economic storm. I want to bring my wonderful son-in-law Trent up to the stage to share some incredibly exciting news about the financial future of our community." The congregation burst into enthusiastic applause. Trent stood up from the VIP table, confidently adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He kissed Sasha on the cheek and jogged up the carpeted stairs to the stage. He shook my father's hand, pulling him into a firm, masculine embrace, before stepping up to the clear acrylic podium. The smug, triumphant smirk on his face was absolutely nauseating. He looked out over the sea of faces soaking up the applause with extreme arrogance. He believed he was completely untouchable. "Thank you." Pastor Thomas Trent began, his voice smooth and heavily practiced. "When I married into the Carter family, I promised to protect this incredible legacy. The financial markets are ruthless, and lately they have been incredibly volatile, but through strategic planning and a recent miraculous blessing, our family was able to secure a massive new asset. He paused for dramatic effect, leaning closer to the microphone. Tonight, I am officially launching the Carter Legacy Investment Fund. This fund will be the bedrock of our church moving forward, ensuring that our community continues to thrive and dominate the financial landscape. We have secured the necessary capital to completely eliminate all of our outstanding church debts and push us into a glorious new era of unprecedented prosperity. Everyone in this grand room will witness the dawn of true, unyielding financial power very soon. He smiled widely, believing the stolen property was his. Trent opened his mouth to continue his speech, but the next words never came out. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the massive banquet hall suddenly slammed open with a deafening crash that echoed like a gunshot. The instrumental background music instantly stopped. Every single head in the massive banquet hall snapped toward the back entrance. The collective gasp from hundreds of wealthy church members sounded like a sudden rush of wind. I stood framed in the grand doorway, perfectly illuminated by the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not look like the completely broken and bankrupt failure they had left rotting in that dirty decoy apartment. I looked like absolute royalty. My custom-tailored emerald green designer gown swept across the plush carpet with an effortless, quiet luxury. The flawless diamond necklace resting against my collarbone caught the bright stage lights, sending brilliant flashes of white fire dancing across the room. Marcus walked casually by my right side, wearing a razor-sharp navy blue suit and carrying a slim leather portfolio. Flanking us were 4 massive private security guards dressed in immaculate black suits with discreet earpieces. They formed an impenetrable human wall around me. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the sharp, confident click of my designer heels hitting the floor as I began my slow, deliberate march down the center aisle. I kept my eyes locked directly on the stage. Trent was gripping the clear acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. His smug, triumphant smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Next to him, my father. Pastor Thomas stood frozen like a statue, his mouth slightly open in shock. Down at the VIP table, Sasha had dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the floor, but nobody even looked her way. As I reached the halfway point of the long center aisle, the frozen spell suddenly broke. My mother, Eleanor, leaped up from her prominent seat at the VIP table. Her silver dress flashed violently as she rushed down the aisle to intercept me before I could reach the stage. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure panic and desperate rage. She threw her arms out wide, trying to physically block my path like a frantic crossing guard. "What on earth do you think you are doing, Zendaya?" She hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper, meant only for my ears. "You are completely ruining the most important night of our lives. You need to turn around and walk right back out those doors this instant." I stopped walking. My security team instantly stepped forward, forming a protective barrier. But I raised my hand slightly, signaling them to give me a small amount of space. I looked down at my mother. Up close, her perfect church lady facade was completely crumbling. I could see the thick layer of sweat forming under her heavy makeup. "I am just here to attend the anniversary gala." "Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "I heard Trent was making a massive financial announcement tonight. I certainly did not want to miss the big reveal." Eleanor grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into my skin, just like Trent had done days ago. "You are completely unhinged," she whispered frantically, her eyes darting around to see if the congregation was listening. "You rented a fancy dress and hired these thugs just to cause a humiliating scene. You are acting entirely crazy. Zendaya, You are having a severe mental breakdown in front of the entire community. I told you to stay hidden in that basement until we could get you into a proper psychiatric facility. If you do not leave this building right now, your father will have his ushers throw you out onto the street." She tugged on my arm, trying to pull me toward the side exit. I did not move a single inch. I just stared at her, feeling a profound sense of absolute pity. She was so blinded by her own greed and her desperate need to maintain her fake social status that she could not even recognize the absolute danger standing right in front of her. She genuinely believed I was just a hysterical woman, throwing a final desperate tantrum. "Please let go of my arm. Go." "Eleanor!" I commanded sharply, dropping the title of mother completely. She flinched at my cold tone, keeping her grip tight. "You were not invited to this event." "Zendaya," she seethed, her face turning a dark shade of angry red. "This is an exclusive private gathering for our church community. You have absolutely no right to be here. You have no money and no power. Leave before I call the police." I gracefully sidestepped. My frantic mother looked directly at the shocked, silent crowd and said loudly, "I was invited by the legal owner of this building, which is me." The entire banquet hall erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps. My mother Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the center aisle, her jaw practically unhinged. I did not spare her another single glance as I walked away. I continued my slow, confident march toward the elevated stage, my emerald green designer gown sweeping elegantly across the plush red carpet. The sea of wealthy church members parted instantly for my security team, pulling their chairs back and staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. They had known me my entire life as the quiet older sister who never fought back. Seeing me flanked by massive bodyguards and dripping in flawless diamonds completely shattered their conditioned perception of who I was. As I reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs leading up to the main stage, Trent suddenly snapped out of his terrified paralysis. His survival instincts kicked in, driving him to protect his massive web of lies at all costs. He abandoned the clear acrylic podium and rushed down the steps. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He threw his long arms out aggressively, attempting to physically block my path. "You are not coming up here, Zendaya," he growled, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of pure rage and absolute terror. "I do not know what kind of sick game you are playing tonight, but you are going to turn your expensive heels around right now. You are trespassing on private property, and I will personally throw you out if I have to." Before I could even blink, the two lead security guards stepped seamlessly in front of me, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. The guard on my right simply raised one massive hand and planted it firmly against Trent's chest. With a single, effortless push, he shoved my arrogant white brother-in-law backward. Trent stumbled clumsily up the carpeted stairs, his expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looking ridiculous on his flailing body. He landed incredibly hard on his bruised knees, gasping for air, his eyes wide with profound humiliation. He looked incredibly small and entirely powerless before me. I did not even break my stride. I stepped gracefully around his kneeling form and continued my ascent up the stairs toward the glowing stage lights. My father, Pastor Thomas, finally realized that his pristine religious empire was crumbling before his very eyes. He stepped forward, abandoning his previously frozen state. He puffed out his broad chest and summoned the booming theatrical authority he used to control thousands of devoted followers every single Sunday. "Zendaya Marie Carter," he bellowed, his deep baritone voice echoing loudly across the massive banquet hall, even without a microphone. "You will halt your steps right there. You will not desecrate this holy altar with your profound emotional instability. I command you as your father and as your pastor to step down from this sacred stage immediately. Return to your seat, and we will handle this private family matter quietly in my office." He fully expected me to blindly cower and submit just as I had done for 32 agonizing years. I did not stop moving. I did not hesitate. I simply walked right past him, treating the mighty grand patriarch of the Carter family like an invisible ghost. His booming voice meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium right where Trent had once been standing just moments ago. Trent had scrambled back to his feet and was hovering near the microphone stand, his sweaty hands shaking violently. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and offered him a chilling, perfectly calm smile. I reached out and smoothly wrapped my fingers around the microphone. For a split second, he tried to hold on, but one sharp glare from my advancing security team made him physically release his grip instantly. He scurried backward like a frightened rat, retreating to the safety of my furious father. I slowly adjusted the tall metal microphone, tapping it once firmly. The sharp sound echoed through the silent room, demanding absolute attention from the massive crowd. I calmly looked out over the hundreds of upturned faces, taking a deep breath of the crisp, conditioned air. "Thank you all for your patience," I said, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully across the entire venue. "My family wanted to announce a new financial chapter tonight. They promised you a look into the glorious future of the Carter Legacy Investment Fund. I think that is a fantastic idea. Let us look at the real numbers." I turned my head slightly, nodding to my left. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the stage, pulling a sleek silver tablet from his leather portfolio, and plugged it directly into the church's main projector system. The massive projector screen behind me hummed to life, instantly illuminating the stage with blinding white light. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation as the first slide appeared. It was not a glossy promotional graphic for the Carter Legacy Investment Fund. It was a scanned copy of a highly confidential financial document. Specifically, it was the original mortgage agreement for the very building we were standing in right now, complete with my father's recognizable signature at the bottom. I stepped back up to the microphone, letting the image sink into the minds of the wealthy church members. "As you can clearly see, this is the mortgage for our beloved church," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive speakers. "What my father and my esteemed brother-in-law failed to mention tonight is that this sacred building was used as collateral. My father illegally leveraged the church property to secure a $5 million loan. And he did not do it to feed the homeless or build a new community center. He did it to fund Trent's disastrous gambling addiction on the underground cryptocurrency market." The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. My father staggered backward, his face turning the color of wet ash. Trent was shaking his head violently, looking wildly around the room, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. "But that is only the beginning," I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. Marcus tapped the silver tablet and the slide transitioned smoothly. Another official banking document appeared on the screen. This one detailed a massive application for a secondary loan using my grandmother's inherited estate as the primary collateral. Trent desperately needed another massive infusion of cash to pay off the dangerous criminals he owed, I explained, watching the horror dawn on the faces of the congregation. The bank initially considered the loan, but yesterday morning the regional bank officially denied Trent's application. They denied it because his massive crypto debt had suddenly been purchased by a private holding company. That same private holding company also bought out the entire mortgage of this church, paying the bank a massive lump sum of cash to take over the high-risk loans entirely. I leaned closer to the microphone, locking eyes with my terrified father. "You see, the bank no longer owns this church. The loan sharks no longer own Trent's debt. The private holding company owns everything. They own the debt, they own the mortgage, and they own the absolute right to foreclose on this property immediately." My father grabbed the clear acrylic podium, trying to physically support his suddenly weak legs. "Who?" He stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "Who bought the debt, Zendaya?" I smiled, a cold, hard smile that did not reach my eyes. "I did," I stated clearly, the words hitting the room like a physical shockwave. "I am the sole chief executive officer of that private holding company. I bought your debt. I bought your church. I own everything you have and everything you owe. You are at my mercy now." Pandemonium erupted inside the banquet hall. Church elders began shouting in absolute outrage. Wealthy donors jumped from their seats, demanding immediate answers from my father. Down at the VIP table, my sister Sasha buried her face in her hands, sobbing as her perfect life shattered. But my mother Eleanor refused to accept reality. She scrambled up the carpeted stairs, moving with a frantic, manic energy. Her silver dress flashed under the stage lights as she ran toward me, waving a thick stack of papers in the air. "It is a complete lie!" She screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, cutting through the heavy chaos of the room. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a bankrupt failure. Her company crashed and she lost absolutely everything. She is completely insane and having a massive psychological breakdown right here on this stage." She reached the center of the stage, aggressively shaking the papers at the shocked congregation. "I have the legal proof right here," Eleanor shrieked desperately. "This is a signed medical proxy and a power of attorney. She signed her life over to us because she is entirely unfit to manage her own affairs. She does not own any holding company. She does not own this church. She is a sick, delusional girl who needs to be locked inside a hospital immediately." Marcus calmly stepped out from the shadows and walked directly up to the microphone, standing right beside me. He looked at my frantic mother with absolute professional disdain. "That signature on your document is completely legally fake," he announced, his deep voice commanding the entire room. "This official bank statement, however, is entirely real." Marcus tapped the silver tablet one final time and stepped back from the podium. The massive projector screen behind us flickered before displaying a new image. It was a crisp, high-resolution scan of a certified banking statement. The document bore the official seal of one of the most exclusive financial institutions in the country, and right at the top was my full legal name. The number printed boldly in the center of the screen made the entire banquet hall stop breathing. Under the section labeled Total Available Liquid Assets was the number $60 million. For a long, terrible moment, there was absolutely no sound in the room. Hundreds of wealthy church members stared at the massive glowing numbers, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Then the silence shattered. The room erupted into absolute chaos. People jumped out of their seats, pointing at the screen and shouting in disbelief. My mother Eleanor stood frozen on the stage. The thick stack of fraudulent legal papers slipped from her trembling fingers and scattered across the plush red carpet. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The reality of what she had thrown away, the reality of the daughter she had so eagerly tried to institutionalize, was finally crashing down on her. A few feet away, my father, Pastor Thomas, was physically shaking. He looked from the glowing projector screen to me, and then back to the screen. His knees gave out slightly. The heavy leather-bound Bible he had been clutching so desperately slipped from his grasp. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, heavy thud that reverberated through the microphones. The great patriarch of the Carter family was entirely speechless, his religious authority completely stripped away by cold, hard financial proof. Down at the VIP table, the scene was even more pathetic. Sasha was no longer just crying fake tears. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as the devastating truth washed over her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, realizing that her perfect life built on my stolen inheritance was completely over. But it was Trent who gave me the greatest satisfaction. The arrogant white financial advisor who had mocked my intelligence, who had sneered at my apartment and threatened me with a straitjacket, was completely destroyed. The smug superior smirk was entirely gone from his face. It was replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He backed away from the podium, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat. He looked at the $60 million balance and realized instantly that he was completely outmatched. He had brought a knife to a nuclear war, and I had just pressed the launch button. I leaned closely into the microphone, ensuring my voice cut cleanly through the frantic shouting of the congregation. I let my eyes sweep across the wealthy donors, the church elders, and finally let them rest entirely on my terrified family. "You told everyone I was a failure," I said, my voice perfectly calm and laced with lethal precision. "You told this entire community that my health technology application crashed and burned. You convinced yourselves that because I am a black woman, I was far too emotional to handle real venture capital. You believed your own vicious lies so deeply that you actively plotted to throw me into a psychiatric ward just to steal my grandmother's house. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words settle over the shocked crowd. I pointed a steady finger directly at the projector screen behind me. I did not lose my company, I announced loudly. I sold my company to a massive Fortune 500 medical corporation. They recognized the immense value of my work, and they paid me $60 million in cash for the acquisition. I am not bankrupt. I am not having an emotional breakdown. And I am certainly not a failure. The congregation gasped again, whispering frantically to each other as the pieces of the puzzle finally snapped into place. They looked at my parents with sudden, intense suspicion. If I was incredibly wealthy, then the entire narrative my father had been selling them all night was a massive fabricated lie. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with Trent. He was sweating profusely, pulling desperately at the collar of his expensive custom tuxedo, as if it were suddenly choking him. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew I was not just going to clear my own name, I was going to completely annihilate his. You thought I was a broke emotional failure? I said, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. I sold my app to a Fortune 500 company. What did you do with your investors' money, Trent? Trent opened his mouth, but his voice completely failed him. He stood under the harsh stage lights, sweating profusely, while hundreds of angry eyes burned into him. I did not give him the chance to formulate another pathetic lie. I turned to the congregation and raised my voice so everyone could hear the absolute truth. Trent did not invest your money into a legitimate corporate portfolio, I announced clearly. He took every single dollar you entrusted to him and gambled it away on highly illegal offshore cryptocurrency markets. He lost $5 million in a matter of weeks. And when the violent underground loan sharks came to collect, he manipulated my father into illegally mortgaging this very building to cover his massive criminal tracks. Shouts of pure outrage exploded across the banquet hall. Several older church members who had clearly given Trent their life savings began pushing their way toward the front, demanding their money back. Trent held his hands up defensively, taking another terrified step backward. "Listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "The market was volatile. I was trying to double your returns. I was trying to elevate this community. You people do not understand how high finance works. I was doing you a massive favor by managing your meager assets." His blatant attempt to play the misunderstood white savior even now was absolutely sickening. I nodded to Marcus, who was standing right beside the audio control board. "We anticipated you would try to spin this into a noble sacrifice, Trent," I said coldly. "That is why Marcus hired a private investigator to track your movements over the last month. Would you like the congregation to hear what you truly think of the people you claim to be saving?" Marcus pressed a button on the soundboard. The heavy church speakers crackled to life. Trent's own voice filled the massive room, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. It was a recording from a dark bar downtown taken just 2 days ago. "They are just a bunch of gullible sheep," Trent's recorded voice sneered, followed by the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "These church people are completely clueless. You put on a nice custom suit, toss around some financial buzzwords, and they practically throw their retirement funds at you. They are so desperate to be part of the elite club, they will trust any white guy who promises to make them rich. It is honestly pathetic how easy it is to bleed them dry." The congregation gasped in collective horror. The sheer racist arrogance in his voice was unmistakable. But the recording was not finished yet. The private investigator on the tape asked Trent about his wife. Sasha Trent laughed cruelly, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "My wife is a vapid idiot. She only cares about designer shoes and expensive tennis bracelets. As long as I keep buying her shiny things, she will never ask where the money comes from. She is way too stupid to realize we are completely broke. I only married into that family because her father had access to the massive church treasury. They are all just stepping stones." Marcus abruptly cut the audio. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than before. The illusion of the perfect Carter family was entirely obliterated. Trent stood frozen on the stage, his face completely drained of color. He looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. He tried to open his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but there were absolutely no words left to save him. I looked down at the VIP table. My sister Sasha was standing perfectly still. The diamond tennis bracelet she had been flaunting all evening suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy chain around her wrist. Her perfect blonde hair fell slightly out of place as she stared up at the man she had fiercely defended, the man she had eagerly helped betray me for. He did not love her. He despised her. He thought she was an absolute fool. Sasha slowly walked up the carpeted stairs toward the stage. Her eyes were completely hollow. Trent saw her coming and reached his hand out weakly. "Sasha, baby," he stammered, taking a step toward her. "You know I did not mean that. I was just stressed out. I was drinking heavily." Sasha did not say a single word. She walked directly up to him, raised her hand high into the air, and slapped Trent across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp crack echoed through the entire church. It was a vicious, brutal strike that instantly left a bright red handprint on his pale cheek, causing him to violently stumble backward in shock and profound pain. Trent raised his hand to his stinging cheek, staring at his wife in absolute disbelief. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the unified front of the Carter family was already disintegrating into vicious fragments. My father, Pastor Thomas, saw the enraged faces of his wealthy congregation closing in on the stage, and his survival instincts kicked into maximum overdrive. He immediately recognized that Trent was a sinking ship, and he was completely prepared to let him drown to save his religious empire. My father stepped away from the podium, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at his son-in-law. "Do not look at her, you wicked deceiver," my father roared, using his loudest, most theatrical preaching voice. "You lied to us. You came into my holy house and manipulated my innocent family. You told me those church funds were being safely invested in government bonds. I had absolutely no idea you were gambling with the sacred offerings of this congregation. I am a victim of your financial trickery just like everyone else in this room." Trent whipped his head around, his eyes wide with profound betrayal. "You gave me the authorization codes, Thomas," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You signed the mortgage transfer documents yourself. You knew exactly where that money was going because you wanted a 30% cut of the crypto profits. Do not stand there and play the innocent man of God when you were the one demanding faster returns." My mother, Eleanor, immediately jumped into the fray, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny scrap of social status she had left. She lunged forward, grabbing my father's arm and positioning herself as the fiercely protective matriarch. "How dare you accuse my husband of such vile things?" she screamed at Trent, her face twisted with rage. "We trusted you. We gave you our beautiful daughter and you treated her like absolute garbage. You are nothing but a common criminal, and we will testify against you in a court of law to ensure you rot in a federal prison cell." Sasha was still crying hysterically, wiping her mascara-stained eyes as she backed away from Trent. "I want a divorce," she sobbed loudly, ensuring the entire VIP section could hear her. "I am filing the paperwork tomorrow morning. You are completely dead to me, Trent." The sheer hypocrisy of their rapid betrayal was almost beautiful to witness. Just 48 hours ago, they were a united front aggressively trying to lock me inside a psychiatric ward to protect this very man. Now they were violently tearing him apart like starved wolves turning on the weakest member of their pack. They would say or do absolutely anything to avoid taking accountability for their own massive crimes. Trent looked at his wife, then at my screaming mother, and finally at my furious father. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely alone. The wealthy church members were pulling out their cell phones, dialing their lawyers and the local authorities. His fake corporate empire was gone. His marriage was destroyed. and the dangerous underground loan sharks were actively hunting him down for their $5 million. His terrified eyes darted across the stage until they finally landed on me. The arrogant white financial advisor who had constantly belittled my intelligence suddenly saw me as his only remaining lifeline. He stumbled forward, falling heavily onto his bruised knees right at the edge of my designer emerald gown. "Zendaya, please," he begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic whimpering sob. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. "You have $60 million, Z. You are incredibly rich now. 5 million is nothing to you. It is pocket change. Please, you have to lend me the money to pay off those loan sharks. They are going to kill me. They know where I live. They will break my legs and throw me in the river. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever contracts you need. Just please, save my life." He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my expensive dress, but my security guard immediately kicked his hands away. Trent stayed on his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, completely stripped of his massive white privilege and his suffocating arrogance. He was begging a black woman he had deeply despised to throw him a financial life preserver. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence of my response stretch out. I looked down at his kneeling form, feeling zero pity in my heart. "You chose to be a parasite instead of working hard. You should have learned to code, Trent," I said, my voice cold and empty. Suddenly, the piercing wail of police sirens echoed loudly outside the church. The heavy wooden doors of the banquet hall swung open, but this time, it was not me making an entrance. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed boldly across the back swarmed into the room. They moved with military precision, fanning out across the plush red carpet and completely surrounding the elevated stage. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers outside spilled through the stained glass windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the terrified congregation. Trent let out a high-pitched shriek that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. He scrambled backward across the wooden stage, desperately trying to crawl away from the advancing agents. But there was nowhere left for him to hide. Two massive federal officers grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. Trent struggled wildly, thrashing his arms and kicking his expensive leather shoes against the floor. "Trenton Miller, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal financial crimes," the lead agent announced, his voice booming over the lingering murmurs of the crowd. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it right now." Trent did not remain silent. He began sobbing hysterically, screaming at the top of his lungs as the agents forcefully twisted his arms behind his back and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud metallic click echoed sharply through the microphone that was still resting on the podium. He looked back at Sasha, begging her to call a lawyer, but she had already turned her back on him completely. He looked at my father, pleading for the church to intervene, but the pastor was frozen in absolute terror. "Please, you have to believe me," Trent screamed, as the agents began dragging him down the carpeted stairs. I was framed. It was all a massive misunderstanding. "Thomas, tell them I was just following your direct orders. Tell them it was your idea to mortgage the church property." His pathetic cries faded into breathless sobs as they dragged him down the long center aisle. The wealthy church members who had just minutes ago applauded his financial genius were now standing on their chairs, holding up their cell phones. Hundreds of cameras flashed, recording every single second of his humiliating downfall. They captured the tears streaming down his red face and the way his custom tuxedo dragged across the floor. By tomorrow morning, this video would be plastered all over local news networks and social media platforms. The pristine, untouchable reputation of the Carter family was being completely annihilated in real time, broadcasted for the entire world to see. I stood on the stage watching him disappear through the heavy oak doors, feeling an overwhelming sense of vindication. The white savior who had constantly belittled my intelligence and threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward was now headed to a federal holding cell. He would trade his tailored suits for a cheap orange jumpsuit, and his arrogant smirk would be permanently erased from his face. But the federal agents were not finished yet. The lead officer adjusted his tactical belt and calmly walked back up the stairs toward my parents. The massive banquet hall, which had just been filled with the chaotic noise of Trent's arrest, suddenly fell into a tense, suffocating silence. The congregation lowered their phones slightly, watching with bated breath as the agent approached the great patriarch and the devoted First Lady of the church, my mother. Eleanor instinctively shrank back, her silver dress shimmering nervously under the harsh stage lights. She grabbed my father's arm, hiding behind him like a frightened child. My father, Pastor Thomas, tried to puff out his chest and summon his righteous authority one last time. "Officer, there has been a terrible mistake," he stammered nervously, his deep voice shaking violently. "That man deceived us all. We had absolutely no knowledge of his illegal offshore activities. We are merely the innocent victims of his elaborate financial manipulation." The lead federal agent did not look mildly amused at all. He reached inside his dark windbreaker and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. He did not hand them over gently. He practically slapped them directly against my father's chest, forcing the pastor to hastily grab them before they fell to the floor. "Thomas and Eleanor Carter," the agent said, his voice carrying clearly across the incredibly silent room. "You are both hereby served with official federal subpoenas. You are ordered to appear in federal court to answer to serious charges of conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud and severe elder abuse for your coordinated criminal attempt to fraudulently seize the inherited estate of an elderly family member." The heavy manila envelope slapped against my father's chest with a finality that completely drained the remaining life from the room. The federal agents did not wait for a response. They simply turned around and marched back down the long carpeted aisle, leaving the great Pastor Thomas clutching the legal documents like they were made of burning coals. He looked completely broken. His broad shoulders slumped, and his pastoral authority entirely evaporated into the cold air of the banquet hall. My mother Eleanor stared at the thick envelopes in his trembling hands, and something inside her finally snapped. The terrifying reality of federal prison, the complete loss of her wealthy social circle, and the absolute destruction of her pristine country club image crashed down upon her all at once. She abandoned my father instantly. She did not try to comfort him or offer a prayer of support. Instead, she whipped her head around and locked her panicked eyes entirely on me. She scrambled across the wooden stage, her silver dress catching under her heels, causing her to stumble awkwardly. She fell to her knees just a few feet away from me. The perfect church lady facade was gone forever. The tears streaming down her face this time were not a calculated theatrical performance. They were absolutely real, born from pure, unadulterated terror. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, making her look completely unhinged. "Zendaya, please," she wailed, her voice cracking loudly, echoing through the microphone I still stood beside. "You have to stop this. You have to tell those federal agents it was all a massive mistake. You have the money now, Zendaya. You have $60 million. You can afford the best defense attorneys in the entire world. You can pay whatever fines they want. You can make all of this terrible nightmare just go away." My security guards took a step forward, ready to physically remove her, but I raised my hand slightly, ordering them to hold their positions. I wanted the entire congregation to see exactly who this woman truly was. I wanted them to witness the absolute depths of her manipulation. When she saw that I was not ordering my guards to throw her out, she took it as a sign of weakness. She crawled slightly closer, reaching her trembling hands out toward the hem of my emerald green designer gown. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and played the only card she had left in her pathetic deck. "I am your mother," she sobbed violently, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. "I carried you in my womb for 9 long months, Zendaya. I gave you life. I fed you and clothed you and kept a roof over your head when you were just a helpless child. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You cannot stand there and watch them put the woman who gave you life into a cold, dark prison cell. We made a mistake, Zendaya. We were just confused and frightened by Trent's lies. But deep down, I have always loved you. You are my firstborn child. Please have mercy on your own mother." Her desperate pleas bounced off the vaulted ceilings of the church. A few members of the congregation looked away, unable to stomach the pathetic display of a mother begging her daughter for salvation after plotting her total destruction. Sasha remained frozen at the VIP table, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the family collapse. My father just stood there, clutching his federal subpoenas, staring blankly at the floor. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. A year ago, seeing my mother cry genuine tears would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. I would have dropped to my knees, wrapped my arms around her, and surrendered every single thing I owned just to make her feel safe. They had conditioned me my entire life to be their emotional sponge and their financial safety net. But standing on that stage, bathed in the bright, warm light of the crystal chandeliers, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my veins. There was no sadness, no grief, and certainly no mercy. I did not yell at her. I did not scream about the immense pain she had caused me or the cruel betrayal I had suffered. I did not waste my breath trying to explain how a real mother would never hand her daughter a fake medical proxy. I maintained a perfectly calm and completely steady demeanor. I slowly reached down and unclasped my expensive designer clutch. The soft metal latch was barely audible over her loud, pathetic sobbing. I reached inside and calmly pulled out a single piece of folded paper. I unfolded the crisp white paper, slowly letting the silence stretch out between us. My mother Eleanor stopped her frantic sobbing for a brief moment, her tear-filled eyes tracking my movements with pure confusion. She thought I was pulling out a checkbook or a legal pardon. Instead, I held the paper out and let it drop, fluttering gently until it landed right on the wooden stage next to her trembling knees. "Pick it up!" I commanded, my voice echoing loudly. Eleanor hesitated, her hands shaking violently. She reached out and picked up the paper, unfolding it with clumsy fingers. She stared at the black ink printed on the page and the remaining color completely drained from her face. "Do you know what that is?" Eleanor, I asked, stepping slightly closer to her kneeling form. "That is a certified transaction receipt from my oldest checking account. It shows a withdrawal of exactly $5,000. I turned my head slightly so the entire congregation could hear my next words clearly. 5 days ago, my lawyer advised me to test my family. I called my mother in tears. I told her my company had completely failed, that investors were suing me, and that I was facing absolute financial ruin. I begged her for help. I told her I had absolutely nothing left. The wealthy church members stared at my mother in absolute disgust. Eleanor tried to open her mouth to speak, but I quickly cut her off. "Exactly 10 minutes after I made that desperate phone call, you logged into my old college checking account," I said, staring coldly down at her. "You saw that I only had $5,000 left to my name. You did not ask if I had enough money to buy groceries. You did not ask if I had enough money to pay my rent or keep my heat turned on. You did not even call me back to offer a single word of comfort. Instead, you transferred every single penny of my last remaining funds directly into your own personal account." Eleanor gasped, clutching the paper to her chest. "Zendaya, please," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just moving it for safekeeping. I wanted to protect it from the federal creditors." I let out a short, bitter laugh that held absolutely zero warmth. "You were protecting it from me," I corrected her sharply. "You thought I was bleeding out on the floor, and your first maternal instinct was to pick my pockets before the ambulance arrived. Do not ever kneel before me and dare to speak about a mother's love. If you truly loved me, you would never have stolen my last dime. You did not carry me for 9 months out of love. You carried me because you needed a prop for your perfect church family image." Eleanor collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against the hard wooden stage, sobbing uncontrollably. The wealthy donors and church elders in the front row began turning their backs on her, whispering in fierce condemnation. She had lost her daughter, her son-in-law, her freedom, and now she had lost the only thing she truly cared about, which was her pristine social reputation. I stepped over her shaking body and walked directly toward my father. Pastor Thomas was still standing near the acrylic podium, completely paralyzed by his own impending doom. He clutched the federal subpoenas to his chest, as if the thick manila envelopes could somehow shield him from my wrath. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive tailored suit and his perfectly groomed hair. "You built this entire empire on lies." Thomas said, my voice low and absolute. "You stood on this stage every Sunday preaching about greed and temptation, while you secretly gambled away the offerings of your devoted followers. You demanded respect and absolute submission, but you are nothing more than a common thief hiding behind a holy collar." My father swallowed hard, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "Zendaya," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This church is my entire life. It is our family legacy." "It was your legacy," I corrected him smoothly. "I bought your debt, Thomas. I hold the massive mortgage you illegally secured to fund Trent's criminal activities. You have broken every single clause of that financial agreement." I took a step backward, preparing to leave the stage. I looked at the broken, weeping family I was finally leaving behind. "Pack up your office," I announced, my voice ringing with brutal finality. "I am calling the private holding company in the morning. Your precious church will be foreclosed on by Monday." I turned my back on them completely as they fell to their knees, sobbing loudly on the sacred altar. I did not hesitate for a single second. As I descended the carpeted stairs of the elevated stage, behind me the chaotic sounds of my family completely imploding filled the massive banquet hall. My mother was wailing uncontrollably, her theatrical sobs echoing off the vaulted ceilings, while my father muttered broken, desperate prayers that no one was ever going to answer. I tuned them out entirely. Their voices no longer held any power over my mind or my spirit. They were just empty noise. I reached the bottom of the stairs and my private security team immediately fell into perfect formation around me. But they did not even need to clear a path. As I turned to face the long center aisle, the sea of wealthy church members instinctively parted. Hundreds of people stepped back hastily, pulling their chairs out of my way. The silence among the congregation was absolute and profound. There were no whispers of judgment and no condescending glares. The men and women who had spent my entire life looking down on me now stared with wide eyes filled with a mixture of raw fear and newfound respect. They recognized that the quiet, submissive daughter they once pitied had just ruthlessly dismantled the most powerful religious dynasty in the city in under 20 minutes. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. My designer emerald gown swept across the plush red carpet with every deliberate step. I looked straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the crowd. I did not need their validation or their apologies. I passed the VIP table where Sasha was still sitting, completely paralyzed. She looked like a hollow porcelain doll staring blankly at the shattered remains of her fake luxury life. I walked right past her without slowing my pace. The walk down that aisle felt like crossing a massive, invisible threshold. With every single step I took toward the grand foyer, I could feel the invisible chains of a 32-year toxic dynamic actively snapping one by one. I had spent 3 decades bending over backward, trying to earn the love of people who only viewed me as a convenient financial asset. I had swallowed my pride, accepted their racial microaggressions, and allowed them to constantly diminish my accomplishments just to keep the peace. I had let them convince me that I was a burden simply for existing. But that suffocating era was officially over. I reached the back of the banquet hall and stepped into the grand foyer. The heavy, solid oak doors were standing wide open from when the federal agents had stormed the building. I walked straight through the massive entryway and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The sudden change in temperature hit my skin like a physical shock, waking me up from a long, terrible nightmare. I stopped at the top of the concrete steps and took a slow, deep breath. My lungs expanded fully, for what felt like the very first time in my entire life. The heavy, crushing weight that had sat squarely on my shoulders since childhood completely vanished. I was finally free. I was no longer Zendaya, the disappointment. I was no longer the emotional black woman they tried to institutionalize. I was a $60 million titan who had just bought her own absolute freedom. The church parking lot was a chaotic scene of flashing red and blue police lights. Several federal cruisers were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn. I could hear Trent still crying in the back of a squad car, his pathetic whining muffled by the thick bulletproof glass. News vans were already beginning to pull into the driveway, their bright camera lights illuminating the meticulously manicured, green landscaping. The aggressive media frenzy was just starting, and by tomorrow morning, the entire world would know exactly what the Carter family had done. But I had absolutely no intention of sticking around to answer intrusive questions from eager local reporters. My part in this tragic, exhausting play was completely finished. I walked down the concrete steps, the gentle night breeze pulling at the luxurious fabric of my long emerald gown. Marcus was standing patiently at the bottom of the stairs, leaning against the sleek black exterior of a massive Maybach. He had a quiet, deeply satisfied smile playing on his lips. He opened the heavy rear passenger door for me as I approached the luxury vehicle. "We did exactly what we came to do," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly professional. "It is time to go home, Zendaya." I nodded silently and gracefully slid into the comfortable leather back seat. Marcus closed the heavy door firmly, sealing me safely inside. I never looked back as the car drove swiftly away. 6 months passed since that chaotic night at the church gala. I never saw my parents or my sister again. The fallout was swift and absolutely merciless. Trent pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and money laundering to avoid a longer sentence. He is currently serving 10 years in a minimum security federal prison. Sasha filed for divorce immediately, but the damage to her reputation was already permanently done. She went from dripping in stolen diamonds to working a minimum wage retail job just to afford a tiny studio apartment. My parents faced a completely different kind of prison. The private holding company foreclosed on the megachurch and their lavish suburban home within a matter of weeks. The federal fraud investigation completely stripped my father of his pastoral credentials. The wealthy congregation that once worshipped the ground they walked on completely abandoned them. They were forced to move into a cramped, subsidized apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Their pristine country club image, their generational wealth, and their suffocating social power were entirely reduced to absolute ash. I did not shed a single tear for the absolute destruction of their pathetic false empire. They brought every single terrifying consequence upon themselves, and they truly deserved their miserable solitary fate. Instead of dwelling on the past, I focused entirely on building my actual future. I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my brand new corner office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the bustling city, but I was not focused on the skyline. I was looking at the freshly printed brochures for my newest venture. While the $60 million tech acquisition gave me absolute financial freedom, I knew I needed a deeper purpose. I took a significant portion of my wealth and officially opened the Carter Vanguard Legal Clinic. I partnered with Marcus and a team of top-tier defense attorneys to create a heavily subsidized legal sanctuary specifically designed to protect Black women from financial exploitation and familial abuse. We provided elite legal representation, forensic accounting, and psychological support to women who were being actively manipulated by the people they trusted the most. I wanted to ensure that no woman would ever have to stand in a dirty decoy apartment and face the terrifying threat of a fraudulent psychiatric hold just because her family wanted to steal her hard-earned assets. The clinic lobby was already completely packed with clients who desperately needed our help. Every time I walked through those glass doors, I felt a profound sense of genuine fulfillment that no amount of money could ever buy. I finally understood the true definition of generational wealth. It was not about hoarding millions of dollars in offshore accounts or wearing custom designer gowns to impress a room full of hypocritical strangers. True wealth was the absolute freedom to walk away from toxic environments without fear of total financial ruin. True wealth was having the power to establish unbreakable boundaries and having the resources to fiercely enforce them. For 32 years, I believed that blood ties were a sacred bond that required infinite sacrifice and unconditional forgiveness. I had allowed my family to drain my energy, exploit my brilliant mind, and manipulate my emotions simply because we shared the same last name. But blood does not automatically make someone your true family. Family is a conscious choice. Family consists of the people who actively protect your peace, celebrate your genuine victories, and stand firmly by your side when the entire world tries to tear you down. Marcus walked into my office carrying a fresh stack of legal files. He smiled warmly, dropping them onto my desk. "We have 3 new victories today, Zendaya," he announced, his voice filled with pride. 3 more women who are finally completely free. I smiled back, picking up the top file. My chosen family was right here in this building. The heavy chains of my past were permanently broken. I looked directly into the camera lens, addressing the audience who had followed this exhausting and triumphant journey. We are taught from a very young age to honor our parents and protect our siblings at all costs. We are conditioned to endure endless psychological abuse under the false guise of unconditional family love. But you do not owe your sanity to anyone. You do not owe your hard-earned success to people who secretly pray for your downfall. Do not ever let toxic blood ties chain you to a life of misery and financial abuse. You have the absolute right to cut the dead branches from your tree so you can finally grow. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who are supposed to love you the most? Share your story below. The most profound lesson embedded within this story is that biological ties do not obligate you to endure psychological or financial abuse. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond, requiring infinite patience and unconditional forgiveness. However, as Zendaya's journey brutally illustrates, blood simply indicates a shared genetic history, not guaranteed loyalty or love. When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to exploit your vulnerabilities for their own selfish gain, you have the absolute right to sever those ties entirely. Financial abuse orchestrated by family members is a devastating reality for many people. The expectation to act as a permanent safety net often traps individuals in toxic cycles where their achievements are minimized and their resources are drained. Zendaya's strategic retaliation highlights the necessity of establishing ironclad boundaries. True empowerment comes from recognizing that your well-being, sanity, and hard-earned success are worth protecting, even if the threat comes from inside your own home. It takes immense courage to look at your parents or siblings and accept that they are detrimental to your survival. Walking away from toxic relatives is never an easy decision, and the grief of mourning a family you never truly had is a heavy burden to carry. Yet this narrative proves that closing the door on manipulation opens the window to genuine freedom. You are allowed to redefine what family means and actively choose the people who respect your peace. By protecting your assets and your emotional health, you create space to thrive on your own terms, surrounded by authentic supporters instead of opportunistic parasites. You deserve to live completely, without the constant exhausting pressure of proving your inherent worth to people who are stubbornly determined to misunderstand and diminish you.